Well, I'd probably emphasise that the health sector needs to recognise the concept of environmental determinants of health, which have been surprisingly slow to jump on board public health and medical education. So everyone knows about social determinants of health, but there's a lot of research around concepts of environmental deprivation and environmental degradation. So lack of time in nature, lack of connection to nature means that it leads to a cycle of decline in environmental resources because people don't value them, as well as physical and mental health declines. And then environmental degradation itself can cause illness. So in medical education, I think it's really key for that to be emphasised. In terms of other roles, I think I'm going to focus on climate change because I think that's sort of my specialty in this panel, but I think that the health sector needs to be aware of the vulnerable groups that will be affected by climate change in cities, so particularly the elderly, the young, and those who have lower socioeconomic status who won't be able to cope with some of the changes in cities.
Thanks. It's really interesting. If you look at those livability domains, employment, transport, social infrastructure, the health sector is actually part of all of those domains, in fact, probably all of them. In my work, for the last 5.5 years, working to engage health sector stakeholders in actually getting involved in the determinants of health and thinking about urban planning, thinking about the built form. There was a lot of initial this sort of behaviour, which was, talk to the hand, we're busy managing our service and dealing with our clients and managing our... I'm thinking about the primary care partnership networks in Victoria. Initially they were saying that we don't have time to think about this stuff. It's all very well for you to talk upstream and talk about urban planning, but we're here to service our members. But then when you start to remind any health sector that they're actually part of a neighbourhood, they are an employer. How do their clients and staff get to the building? Do they walk? Do they wait 2.5 hours for a disability taxi? Do they wait for a bus that runs once a day? People have to think spatially about their service as part of the social fabric, part of the economic capital, part of the social capital, and in terms of the resources consumed, part of the natural capital as well. So, and again, in terms of fostering a vibrant local community, they're part of the developing human capital. In Plan Melbourne, we're working to influence Plan Melbourne right now, a coalition of my department plus the Heart Foundation and the University of Melbourne and the Planning Institute of Australia to unpack what this 20-minute neighbourhood means, because that's one of the key features of Plan Melbourne. And it's really important that health sector, I urge you to jump onto that Plan Melbourne policy framework if you live here in Melbourne or wherever you live. Use those frameworks to think about how the health sector actually influences outcomes across those policy environments and what it means for the health sector to actually create local jobs, create local learning opportunities, use local resources, influence transport. The Western Health in St Albans, the large hospitals, finally been able to influence the resiting of a train station so that it's right opposite the hospital where it should have been put 25 years ago. In terms of, and Melanie, I'll finish with this. One of the resources I found very useful is by Ron Labonte, who a few years ago identified 5 ways that the health sector could influence the non-medical determinants of health. And he talked about people can choose to work as an advocate or a catalyst. They can become an educator or a watchdog. They can become a partnership developer. They can get involved in community capacity building, and they can also get involved in resource brokering. It's probably just a different way of reframing the Ottawa Charter, but you'd be amazed how little the Ottawa Charter is used in its full capability. And when we started using this framework, we were able to shift the thinking of some, for example, primary care partnership networks. So they started to think much more holistically about their role as a shaper of community governance, and they're now getting involved in placemaking, and they're collaborating with local governments and other stakeholders to build up the functionality and the livability of places like downtown St Albans. So there is a huge role for the health sector to play in building healthy environments. Thanks.
Thanks for that.
Can I just add one more thing?
Yeah, of course.
I think another big thing is that the health sector contributes significantly to greenhouse gas emissions, and the UK is really leading in this with the NHS having a sustainability unit. Surprisingly, one of the biggest contributors to the environmental footprint of health services is through pharmaceuticals. The production and waste associated with them, as well as the emissions in waste disposal, as well as obviously transport and other and stationary energy use. So I think there's a key element of responsibility and opportunity for the health system to reduce its carbon footprint and environmental footprint so that it is safeguarding itself for the future in a world where fossil fuels won't be as accessible or used as much, hopefully, and also reducing its contribution to climate change. But I'd agree with that list of things, and I think it's really good.
I've got a question now. I've got a question for you, Lucinda, from the audience. You've spent some time working in some communities in Southeast Asia, and there's a question here about whether you could tell us a bit more about your experiences in increasing connection and getting people more active in these communities.
Yeah, I think much of my inspiration comes from time spent in Southeast Asia. And I think people have been building their own cities forever, for the last 2,000 years. And about 200 years ago, we decided that we need to plan them because we had more people living in cities, and there are some very good reasons why we should plan them now and in the future. But in that, I think we've progressively stripped people of their decision-making role. I don't know who here ever goes to their local council meetings or who has ever felt that they had capacity to change what's on their nature strip or do something in their local area and take some responsibility for that. So I guess what I was inspired by many of the communities, particularly in Cambodia and in Phnom Penh, Ho Chi Minh City, which is where I was working, was here were groups of people who had no land or no legal land, certainly no money, no access to resources or connections, but who were actually working together to create improvements to their neighbourhood. So one group was addressing drainage, another group was working to set up a market space, and another group was building a playground. Simple and low-cost projects, but they were only possible because there was a collective community effort to make it happen. Now, they were having to do that because there was no additional funding, there was no resource commitment, there was no planning in their environment, but I think I learned a lot from their social resilience and actually the power of human nature of what happens when you work together. So some of our work at Co-Design Studio now is actually trying to, people are people, and if given the opportunity to work together on something, people often jump at the chance to do it. So how can we actually motivate and mobilise citizens to become more active in city making during some of those lessons?
Thanks very much, and I think we've got a question from Lloyd in the audience.
Thanks, and I have my own microphone. I recently went to an urban planning workshop with Rob Adams, the city planner, who did a lot of training in Denmark. And the outcome of the forum, it seemed to me, was that to build a healthy and sustainable city, you just need to make it look a lot like Copenhagen. What do you think are the lessons that we can learn from a place like Copenhagen, and can we apply them here in Melbourne?
Go for it.
This is one of my major challenges. I love Rob, and this is not actually anything to do. Rob's a fantastic advocate for Melbourne and has transformed the city. I think one of the challenges is we tend to look around the world at what worked there and thinking, well, that's what we should do here. And one of the greatest risks, I think, as cities grow is urban homogenisation, where everything starts to become more or less the same. And if we think about the places that we know and love in Melbourne, overseas, we know and love them because they're unique. They have identity, culture. And if we start to then plan that out, because everything needs to have this much width of bike lane and this much width of pedestrian footpath, then we lose some of that. But I think what we can learn from Copenhagen is that they've been able to implement policies in a way that have had radical behaviour change in sustainable transport and sustainable buildings, in a much more healthy and sustainable lifestyle. But I think what we should be taking from the lessons there is the policy change and the behaviour change, but then applying that in a way that's very local and that requires a lot of collaboration, and the risk is that we then just build more of the same.
I think too it's important to look at the cultural and philosophical and ideological differences between the two countries. I often say to people that Australia, it's a post-colonial society, it's a post-convict society. It has elements of the pioneer sort of New World attitude where there's a very different relationship to place by the people that own the decisions. I'm not talking about Aboriginal societies, of course, which have maintained very complex and incredibly rich connections to place and their nations. But in this country, we have what I consider personally to be a developer-led economy and a developer-led policy system in terms of planning. I'm imagining that's a very different set of circumstances to Copenhagen, where there's a much stronger, I guess, commitment, I think, to the commons and to shared decision making, and that's possibly a Pollyanna view of that country. It's very easy to look at Denmark with that sort of rose-coloured lens. Do you want to jump in?
Yeah. Just very quickly, because I know we've got lots of questions to answer, but I had the opportunity recently to work on the indicators for Sustainable Development Goal 11, which is on cities, and one of the discussions, which was particularly around public space, I was working with groups, particularly planners from India and Sri Lanka in the workshop that I happened to be in, but all the definitions of the indicators required a Western understanding of public space and use. And that was something that they really challenged. It's not to say that public open space isn't critical, it absolutely is, but if we define it as squares and sidewalks and things, then we're putting a Western lens on that. Yeah.
There's actually a word in the Spanish language called destiera, which is about the psychological impact of forced removal from place. And we don't even have that in the Western English languages. So our understanding of the plight of people seeking asylum or leaving everything they've known behind, we don't even have that lexicon. So when it comes to VCAT and urban planning decisions, we don't even have a cultural framework for understanding what it is that people might be losing. And I think that's really important. So my interest is in the social dimension to urban development, and I think attachment to place, identifying, people are told that they're being emotional when they're told they have to leave their home because a freeway just has to go through, and there's no way of quantifying that necessarily. I'm not sure of the answer yet, but I think some of the livability work is a step in the right direction. Did you want to say something?
No, I think that's
Do we have any other questions from the floor? Got a microphone that can come to you?
While I'm wandering over here, I wonder if you've heard of Creative Suburbs. It's a technology platform to engage people and engage people. Yeah, why don't we just do a Q&A with me? I just wondered if you might like to comment on the way that Creative Suburbs is actually engaging community opinion in development.
Yeah, Alvaro and his team at Creative Suburbs are fantastic, and this is absolutely where we need to be going to have a more deliberative democratic process on city making, and using technology like that to be able to suggest and vote and prioritise ideas, I think, is a core part of what's required. So I encourage you guys to check it out. Yeah.
So my question is, what's the best thing to do about, or alternatively, like what are the key issues that we first need to consider when dealing with congestion in cities like Mumbai, Manila? And the background for that is that presumably planning in these cities has a lot of the basics to cover before we even move on to the more advanced stuff. And planning is constrained by the huge numbers of people, including informal settlements, who have a right and a need to stay somewhere, and sometimes that's protected by law. But at the same time, the ability of such cities to address those needs and cater to those services is very, very limited.
So I think the question's about sort of how do we manage congestion?
Yeah, what do we do about it? There's a lot of informal settlements, and sometimes, when you think about the poor, there's a whole category that's overlooked, the urban poor, because just because they're in cities doesn't mean, we can overlook them, and it's not always just rural distribution of health, etc. So just focusing on that, because we're talking about cities, and I know there's a lot of cutting-edge stuff from a little bit of familiarity with some of your work, but I'm thinking in cities where the problem is this magnified, sometimes I have trouble wrapping my head around how to apply that when the basics aren't covered.
Thank you.
I'll just make a general comment on the evolution of cities. It's quite interesting. I think you've hit on the key point. Having cities are really defined by how quickly people can and easily people can move from their place of work or their place of occupation and their place of living. And cities were once walkable cities, defined by how long it took to walk from one end to the other. And then with the Industrial Revolution, quite thoughtfully, the city designers thought it was better to have suburbs, and people. The city was then defined by the horse and cart, and then it was trams, and then it was trains, and now it's the car city. And I think sometimes we forget that although there is a bit of a lack of design, sometimes it was the right thing to do it in that scenario. And I think we do need to create public transport which can enable people to get around that congestion. That's obviously a tricky thing, but it's a long-term investment. That would probably be what I'd say.
I mean, at a macro level, heavy investment in public transport is the simplest solution to congestion. I'm also incredibly excited by what I think driverless cars will do to all cities in the world. They estimate if we have 80% of people using driverless cars, which is actually, Uber thinks driverless cars will be here within 5 years. I think in Australia, if we're looking in a 10, 20, 30 year time frame, that means that we only need 15% of the number of vehicles on the road to get the same number of trips, or the trips that are predicted for then. So I think we are going to see disruptive technologies help us solve some of those challenges. But I think the combination of congestion, public transport and slums is a very intricated one, interrelated one, which you've picked up on, because I think a lot of the reasons why informal settlements are there is because people are wanting to live near services and jobs, or they wouldn't be living there. And that's often on land reserves that are vacant for some reason, often and are thought to be able to be moved for infrastructure. That completely overlooks the rights that informal settlements would have in that. And I think one of the major challenges is it's not only just a social connection to place, but by resettling people, usually they're being resettled away from the reason that they were there, which is near jobs. And some of the communities I worked in in Cambodia were relocated 20 kilometres out of the centre to the fringe of the city, and they were in much, much better accommodation, but it was going to cost them $1 a day to go back into their work. Now, if you only earn $3 or $4 a day, you can't afford $2 a day on transport, so therefore it's a huge sort of social breakdown. So that holistic picture of why people are living there and considering squatters as having fundamental rights in those decisions is important.
Driverless cars is an interesting one because, what we're talking about today, a lot of is the co-benefits that could be achieved in urban environments by, a single intervention having benefits for both the environment, maybe the economy as well as health. And driverless cars, I think, is a conundrum because it could have all sorts of benefits, but the fact that it's still a car and people are sedentary in those modes of transport is I think a challenge. So if this is the way of the future, how do we try and also maximise physical activity in our cities? We've only got time for probably one more question, and it's a question from the audience about the sort of what is the low-hanging fruit if we are going to achieve healthy, inclusive and sustainable cities. And maybe each of our panellists could just give us sort of what their thoughts are on one key game changer in this space.
Yeah, I'll give one. I think that, obviously public transport is a big one, but I think creating green community spaces is a concept of a third space, and that can really improve mental health and well-being. So not just home, not just work, but you've got somewhere where you can go, where you can sort of connect with other people and the environment. So that can tick off physical activity, mental well-being, fresher air, and importantly in the context of climate change, having green open spaces, if you have 10% of your suburb covered with trees, it reduces the temperature by about 2 degrees, and that's going to be the most significant factor for a lot of Australian cities, which by 2050 are estimated to have, around in Darwin, up to around, about 200 days over 35 degrees. So I think that's a really key point to target. It's fun having green spaces. You can have green roofs, you can have green walls, you can have green parks. So it's kind of interesting. It can get people excited. It can improve mental and physical well-being and address climate change at the same time, or boost resilience, really.
So many. I think when we talk about city making, we can stall by thinking that if we haven't got the long-term plan sorted, that we can't act now, and we plan and plan and plan, and 80% of plans are not implemented. Actually, Harvard Review found. So I think the low-hanging fruit I would say is think about your local neighbourhood and think about one thing that you could change within 90 days, because I'm sure there's something that you could, and if everyone did that, we'd be well on the way to transforming our cities.
I think for me, and apologies, I need to use a Melbourne reference here, but leveraging off the Victorian Public Health and Wellbeing Plan with its focus on livability, leveraging off the Sustainable Development Goals internationally, leveraging off the fact we have a Minister for Cities and the Built Environment at a federal level. We have a Prime Minister who mentions livability and uses it as a metaphor for driving economic development. We absolutely need to work together, all of us, different sectors, to find opportunities to make sure that we put health and wellbeing at the centre of that discussion. We don't have to use the health word if we don't need to. We can talk about livability and talk about building different forms of capital. I would encourage all of us, wherever we live, to run and leverage off whatever local plans, link it all up and work together.
Thanks very much. So unfortunately we have run out of time for the panel, but we've heard some really key messages today about the importance of this issue, so addressing the health and social issues as well as sustainability in our cities. And we've also heard some great suggestions for how we could actually move one step closer to that ideal. And some of those ideas have included use of green open space, how we need to strengthen the use of evidence in decision making, increasing social connection through tactical urbanism, and also that idea of the multidisciplinarity of policy in this space. So if you could perhaps join with me in thanking the three terrific panellists.